Okay, so we're holding the middle of the Gemara here, the Mishnah, actually, a new Mishnah, comparing different halachas in Torah to each other. And we have another tough sugya ahead of us. Let's bring up the text. We'll do the best we can. Okay, so we're holding the middle of page Ches Amid Beis, the Mishnah. Hold on. Ches Amid Beis, the Mishnah. Ein bein zav haroyesh teiriyos. Hey Josh, so we're holding the Mishnah in the middle of Ches Amid Beis 8:2. So the Mishnah says like this: Ein bein zav haroya shtei riyos leroya shalosh ela korban. Okay, just a quick recap for those who are need a recap on the laws of zav and zava. So zav is a seminal discharge different than a balkari. According to Rabbi Steinsaltz, it's a pus. That's a discharge of the man of white. And if a person sees it, if you have a first episode that you have a discharge, so it gets classified as a balkari. A regular person who has a seminal discharge that's tamei, and has to go to the mikveh, etc. Doesn't get qualified or classified as a zav unless they have two riyas, two episodes of discharge. Now it could be two riyas in one day, or it could be two riyas in 2 consecutive days. And so then a person's called a zav katan, a small, not a full zav. And only when the person has three riyas, 3 episodes of seminal discharge, so then it becomes, we're not talking about intercourse, we're talking about the halachas of zav, obviously, are where there's nothing to be toileted. Means we examine and we check the person if there's any reason why there should have been a seminal discharge that could have caused it. And the laws of zav and zav are complex, and there's a special mishnayos for that, and the laws of that, and the Rambam on that. But with all the details, the bottom line is it's not a regular discharge. It's considered an illness, something that discharges for no reason. And if it discharges for no reason, if you have 2 discharges, then you're a zav. And then if you're a 3, then you consider a complete zav. Again, it could be 3 in 3 consecutive days, or two discharges in one day and another day, as we'll see in a second. So, but what is the difference between if you have 2 riyas or 1 riyah, or 3 riyas? So the Mishnah tackles it in our Mishnah here. Ein bein zav haroyesh shtei riyos leroya shalosh ela korban. The only difference between if you have a discharge, I just would jump down a second, just because I'm not sure why this is not mentioned right away. But okay, let's just jump down to Rabbi Steinsaltz's footnote over here. So Rabbi Steinsaltz says, what's a zoiv, a discharge? So the discharge of the zav apparently is the discharge in modern day condition of gonorrhea. So after one contracts this disease, pus begins to discharge from sexual organ, followed by discharge of mucus, and that is, so it kind of maybe looks like a regular seminal discharge, but it's a discharge of a kind of pus that's connected to a virus, to a disease. In the Tosefta and the Gemara, the difference between the seminal emission and an emission of a zav are delineated, I think the word is. The severe impurity of a zav and his executing purification process are detailed in the Torah, Leviticus 15:1-5, and we'll get to that 15:1-15 in Vayikra. So Vayikra Tezvav. And in the Mishnah Tractate Zavim, there's a special tractate that deals with these laws. Although a woman can also contract the disease, a fact acknowledged in the Talmud, only a male becomes impure with the symptoms of a zav. It's not something that affects women as far as purity goes. A woman becomes impure with the impurity of a zava, and a zava is by experiencing the flow of blood not during her menstrual period. So a zava is a different thing that only applies to women. A zav only applies to men. That's not because a man can't have blood as a discharge. That could also happen to a man, but he doesn't become specifically tamei from that. And a woman could have the white discharge, but it's not going to make her a zava. What makes her a zav is having a blood discharge outside of her period, and how the Torah defines it. Today we don't have that kind of certainty like we once did of what's considered a nida, what's considered a zava. As far as a man's concerned, it's a kind of a disease. So that's why the halacha is that we have to examine that there was no cause that could typically cause a person to have a seminal discharge, because then it's not a zav. So we have to, and therefore a zav could also affect even children from an infant's age, from 1 day old. If there's that discharge, then it would be a zav as well. That child is a zav. Now, so what happens if you have 2 discharges? You have to go. The halacha is you have to go to the mikvah, and you have to stay 7 days. We're just going to quickly. I want to quickly look at the psukim, because these psukim get quoted in the Gemara here. Might as well just, instead of trying to figure things out as we learn it, just get it out. Get the text in front of us, and then we could go through the Mishnah. So the pasuk starts in Vayikra 15. Ish zav is a flow. Mipsarai zavai tamehu. So here we have pasuk number 2, says 2 times zav. Zav mipsarai zavai tamehu. And from here we learn that there's a concept of 2 discharges. We're going to reference back to this pasuk. Pasuk Gimel says, "V'zoi stia tumasai b'zayvai." What makes the person a zav? Zav number 1 mentioned in verse number 3. Rar b'sarei azavai. So when the flesh runs with a discharge, second time we say the word zavai in verse 3. Oy hechtim b'sarei, it clogs it, the discharge. Mi zavai tumasai. Okay, so in pasuk 3 it says Gimel, it says 3 times the word zav, and in pasuk Beis it says 2 times the word zav. From this we learn that there's 2 levels of a zav. There's a zav who has 2 discharges, and there's a zav that has 3 discharges. Okay, so obviously talking about 3 after the 2, but the question is, you become a zav already after having 2 discharges, and then you become a higher level of zav, which is after 3 discharges. And our mission wants to examine what is the difference between the 2. Is there a balkari? A balkari means a single discharge, which we attribute to being a balkari, a regular seminal discharge, doesn't have all the strict laws of a zav. So the pasuk continues. Hey, Bruce, we're going through a complex subject here of the zav, of a seminal discharge of the zav that makes the person impure. So we're just going to get the text in front of us before we tackle the Talmud. So the pasuk Beis and Gimel teach us that a person who has the discharge 2 and 3. So there's 2 and there's 3. Then we have pasuk 4 comes to tell us what happens if a person becomes a zav. Anything that he lies on. So we have the person makes anything that he lies or sits on. Anything he lies and sits on, we're going to see includes, hey Aaron, includes anything that supports, even if it's not direct contact. Means it doesn't have to be that he touches it, because that's called negeya. Here we're talking about even if you lie in it. So if you have 3 mattresses or 3 pillows, so everything becomes tummy, everything becomes a support for the zav. Now, v'isha sheyiga b'mishkavai. So we say mishkav and there's mishkav and yishav, right? That's pasuk 4. Anything the zav lies on or sits on becomes tummy. V'isha sheyishkav b'mishkavai. But if he touches it, yichabes begadav v'rachatz b'mayim v'tamei adariv. So then he has to wash himself, and he has to wash it, and it's tummy until the evening. Pasuk 6 continues, "Vayesh v'akli asher yesh elav azav yichabes begadav v'rachatz b'mayim v'tamei adariv." Okay, so if number 5 is if a person touches something that the zav lies on. So the means the laws of Tumah and Taharah again are very complex. So in the laws of Tumah and Taharah, there's something that becomes tamei. The question is, if something becomes tamei, can it make something else tamei? And what can it make else? What can it make impure? So basically, the zav is so tamei. A zav is one of the most highest level of impurity. So a zav is so tamei that the mishkav, whatever he lies on, becomes an avatuma, a father of tuma, and therefore anyone who touches the mishkav, what the bedding of the zav, he himself or she herself becomes tamei and needs to wash their clothing and go to the mikveh. If Isha Shayiga b'mishkavai v'ayoyeshev al kli asher yeshev alav zav, if you were to sit on a chair that the zav sat on, again, you have to wash your clothing. So again, we see that the mishkav and moishav of a zav is something that causes others to become tummy. That means it's an avatuma. If you touch the flesh of the man who has a discharge, again, you become tummy. And you have to wash your clothing and you have to go to the mikvah. If there's going to be any kind of liquid like spit, again, it becomes tummy. Any riding gear which the man with discharge will ride becomes unclean. And he says, if you're noisy, something that becomes tummy from a zav, you also become tummy. So carrying also makes you tummy, not just touching. What the difference of carrying means, how could you carry without touching? You could carry via something else. If you were to hold two pillows, the top pillow which you're not touching, but you're holding it through this bottom pillow, so then it's also become, you're carrying it, that becomes tummy. Okay, so then we're going to just want to get down to 15. Now, another chiddush of a zav. Ukli cheres, even pottery. Asher yiga by hazav, if the zav touches it, yishaver has to be broken because a pottery cannot be made pure. Once it becomes impure, you can't make it pure. V'chol kli eitz yishatev v'mayim, the wood you could wash. V'chiyitar hazav mizave. Now, what's the cleansing process? Okay, so now we know the effect of the zav. He's an av. He creates everything that he lies on, or he sits on, becomes an avatuma. That's a chiddush, right? Now he adds v'chiyitar hazav. How does he become pure? Is mizavai. It means after we're going to see this verse 13 is also, we're going to get back to it in the Talmud in a second. V'chiyitar hazav mizavai. So seemingly all these words are extra. We're going to see. Because it could just said v'chiyitar hazav when he becomes pure. What does it mean v'chiyitar hazav mizavai? It's obvious he's becoming impure. He's coming pure from his discharge. V'safer la'shivas yamim, he counts 7 days. The Taharah from being pure means after he completes, he no longer has a discharge. Then he has to count 7 clean days, like a woman has to count 3 days of from her period. V'chivetz v'gadav, then he has to himself wash himself. V'rachetz b'sarai b'mayim v'chayim v'tar. He can't just go to any mikveh, he has to go to mayim chayim. Again, which is a high level of purity required for the zav. Comes now 14. What happens on the 8th day after he counts 7 days of cleanliness? Means he has 7 clean days, goes to the mikvah. On the 8th day, he brings 2 birds. He has to bring a sacrifice. Okay, so we just read the 15 verses of chapter 15 that deals with the laws of zav. So we learned that he's very impure. He has to count 7 clean days. He goes to the mikvah to mayim chayim, to live water, has to be a spring. Not just any mikvah. And then afterwards, he has to bring a carbon of 2 birds. Okay, that's the laws of a zav. For more details, you could check all the laws in chapter 15. Of course, there's a whole chapter that deals with the laws of zav. Our Gemara wants to know the difference between someone who sees 2 discharges and someone who sees 3s. So he says everything that we've learned in the first 13 verses of the Chumash is all the same. The difference is only carbon. This sacrifice, after counting 7 clean days and going to the mikvah, all the effects of the zav and seeing 2 discharges, what he makes tamei is equal. The only thing is, does he need a kapara? Does he need an atonement? Means when you have to bring a carbon, right? It says echet chatas. One's a chatas. A chatas means a sin offering. Why does he bring a sin offering? It means that a zav, even though we say it's a disease, it's something that's caused by a disease, but the Torah looks at it as an impurity in a level of holiness, and therefore the person requires a kapara. And what does he have to bring? He has to bring a carbon. By the way, the woman also, when she becomes a zava gedola, she also has to bring a carbon. Well, here we're not talking about the zava, we're talking about the zav. But we are going to reference back to the zava because there are going to be some comparisons. Okay, so that's our Mishnah. The roya is shalish riyas, the carbon. The only difference between a man who has a seminal discharge that's called zav, that's unlike a regular a discharge. Again, it can happen It has to be examined exactly. There has to be no cause for it, typical cause for why a person should have a seminal discharge. So then he becomes tummy in that severe level of tumah. If he has it 3 times, he has to also bring a sacrifice. So Rashi says, "Masnishin shrei riyos b'yoyim echad." You could see now how many days is it days related, or is it if you see it, how many discharges? So Rashi says, "Shtei riyos b'yoyim echad." If you have 2 discharges in one day, or 2 days consistently, not 1 day and 1 day off in the 3rd day, but 2 days consistently. Or you have all 3 discharges in 1 day. Means there's a separation between the discharges. Or 3 consecutive days. Basically, it doesn't make a difference. We're not so much counting days, we're counting episodes of discharge. If there's 3 episodes, then you become a full zav, and you have to bring a korban, a sacrifice. If you have 2 discharges, whether it's in 1 day or 2 consecutive days, if there's a day in between, it breaks the cycle, then you're tummy, but you don't have to bring a sacrifice. All right, so now the Reb Sheinzatz quotes as follows. In the Jerusalem Talmud, it notes that there's additional differences between the Zav who experiences 2 emissions and the one who experiences 3 emissions. A Zav who experiences 2 emissions, unlike one who experiences 3 emissions, must ascertain whether it was caused by outside circumstances beyond his control. The answer there is that the Mishnah follows the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, who requires examination for one who experiences three emissions. So he says again, a zav who 2 emissions, unlike one who experiences 3 emissions. So according to the Gemara in Yerushalmi says that that the examination that we have to check if there is an outside cause to cause it, not that it was a disease, so to say, or a sign of impurity, is only checked by 2, but 3 we don't have to examine. They say, well, our Mishnah goes according to Rabbi Elazar that even 3 we have to check if something else caused it. So then there's no difference between 2 and 3. See the Jerusalem Talmud for additional answers. That resolves the question according to all opinions. According to the Rashba, this is not a difficult, as the Mishnah here is discussing the differences between a Zav who experiences 2 emissions and one who experiences 3. It's not defining what is considered an emission. So like we said last week, the Rashba kind of doesn't say we don't have to find every difference. We're focusing on the topic in hand. Here we're trying to figure out, once we already establish if a person's a Zav, how we establish if they're a Zav, that's another discussion. But we know the person's a Zav. So one has 2 emissions, one has 3 emissions. Then once we know they're a Zav, what's the difference? The difference is that you have to bring a sacrifice or not? Okay, he quotes Re'iyah's emissions. The status of one who experiences 1 emission of Zav is that who experiences seminal emission, which means a Balkari. On 1 emission, that person's classified as a typical Balkari, and we don't go further. That's why the pasuk continues in chapter 15, verse 16 is the laws of Shif Chazera. Shif Chazera is a regular Balkari, a regular emission. If one experiences 2 emissions, he's a Zav. Again, we have to examine to know what caused it, and must count 7 days, 7 clean days of emissions, means 7 days after you stopped seeing it, and immerse in a spring water, means Mayim Chayim, to become pure. If one experiences 3 emissions, he's obligated to bring an offering in order to complete his purification, which is what we read about in the end of the subject in the Torah, chapter 15, verse 13, that says you have to bring the 2 birds. The difference between a Zav who experiences 2 emissions and one who experiences 3 emissions is only that the Zav who experiences 3 emissions is obligated to bring the offering, so says the Rambam in Sefer Karbonat Hilchas Mechusri Kapara. Mechusri Kapara means that a person who hasn't yet brought a korban can't eat from Hegdish. Okay. So that's the Mishnah. Like we learned that the Zav is very impure. Means he's a Tameh that makes other things Avatuma. Means that they could cause others. It means there's differences between things that become impure or things that become impure then could cause impurity to others. That's another level of impurity, right? We have many stages of impurity. To make something like a bed, that the bed itself, that someone else who touches the bed, while you're no longer on the bed, just because a Zav lied on the bed. You have to remember, in biblical times, when it says you're impure, it's not just an idea. If you're impure, you can't go into the Beis Hamikdash. You can't eat truma if you're a kohen. You can't go. You can't eat kachim if you sacrifice. There's laws that are punishable by death if you are tamei and you ignore it. You have to get out of that impurity. You have to go to the mikvah. What makes you impure? You have to know these laws. Basically, on a level of awareness that we have today is that, when you talk about that, when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, it's like a ship that's sinking, and you throw off a load. What do you mean you throw off a load? Because if the boat's sinking, you can't have a heavy boat, so you offload some things. So the Gemara brings that as an example of what happened to certain mitzvahs when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. We today, what does the person have to figure out? Is kosher, is this food not kosher? Here we're talking about if I touch a bed, what happens? Not the same thing. There's a high level of awareness of what's going on around you. What are you touching? Where are you walking? Where are you stepping on? So here, but if a person has two emissions, mishkav on the bedding or moishev on the seats, usfir shiva, and then he has to count 7 pure days. You can't just go to the mikveh like a Balkari could go to the mikveh and that's it. You have to count 7 pure days of no emissions and then go to the mikveh tamayim chayim, not just any mikveh. Zev zashavim, they are equal. So the Gemara says, the Rashi says like this: Mishkav v'moishev shachav v'yoshev. If a zav lies or sits, agabe asara begadim, set 10 layers of clothing, and you only touch the top one. You don't touch all 10. Means there's a difference if the zav touches something. But here we're talking about it supports the zav, not it supports the weight of the zav, not that the zav's touching it. He's lying on 10 mattresses. All of them become fathers of Tumah, meaning fathers have children, means they could cause anyone else who touches them become tummy. Even if you don't touch all 10 of them. But if he touches something that's not bedding and not a chair, then that's the difference. If he only causes this kind of severe tumah if he lies or sits. But if he just touches things that are not a chair or not a bedding, then they only become the first level of tumah, and they can't cause other things to become tummy. Therefore, they can't cause other people who touch them. So if you touch, I don't know, a vessel, if someone's a zav and touches a vessel, and someone else touches the vessel after the zav touches him, that person doesn't become tummy. V'kelim and other vessels that touch it. It does make food impure. Again, the level of awareness that you had to have in the times of the Beis Hamikdash is almost impossible. Imagine today we go to the supermarket and you check if something is kosher is hard. To check if something was ever touched by a person who's tamei, and then because of that I'm tamei. That's why you always had to go to the mikveh. You always had to purify yourself. You don't have to be tahor. Only a kohen has to be tahor. For a kohen, the level of awareness was very intense. For a regular Israelite, so you're tamei. When do you have to become tahor? If you want to go to the Beis Hamikdash, or if you want to eat from kachim. V'sfira shiva. Also, the person who's tamei azav has to count 7 days. Mishiyifsuk, when the person stops having the emissions, tzarich limnei zayin nikim. You have to count 7 clean days. Koidim sheyitful, before you can go to the mikvah. You can't go to the mikvah while you're still counting. V'imra zoy ve'echanem sasik kol minyan. If you see and you have a discharge in the 7 days, even if at the end of it, it's all the 7 days don't count. It's not like you can count. Sometimes you have a tumah that only takes off 1 day. This takes off all 7 days, and you have to start counting another fresh 7 days, and then you go to the mikveh, to the mayim chaim, and if you're 3 times on the 8th day, you would bring a carbon. Okay. So the Gemara says, "Minani mili." How do we know that that for all impurities, a zav of two riyas, 2 emissions, and a zav of 3 emissions are the same? But carbon, that's the only difference is the carbon. How do we know this Mishnah? Minani mili. Where do we have the support for this? The Tanur Rabbanan and our rabbis have studied as follows. Rabbi Simai Omer, Rabbi Simai says, Mona Kosif Shtayim Ukra Tami. Okay, remember we learned in Vayikra, it's in the Pasuk 2, it says, Davbnei Yisrael v'marte elem ish ki yi azav, 1 time, mipsar azave 2 times. So we count, the Pasuk says 2 times, and calls that person Tamei. The person's Tamei from only having 2 riyas. And then Pasuk 3 says, Zaistia Tumase Bizavai, Rar Besari Azavai, as Hechtim Besari Mizavai 3 times. So the Shalish, and then the Pasuk says 3 times, Ukari Tami also calls him Tami. Okay, it said. So what do you mean? How could you have 2 and 3? If you're Tami in 2, obviously you're Tami by 3. Why does the pasuk say one pasuk says 2 times Zav and calls the person Tummy, and the 3 times Zav and calls the person Tummy? Shtayim l'tumah, shalish l'karban. That later, when we talk about the kapara, the cleansing process for 2 is everything besides a carbon. The cleansing process, which is connected to chapter 15, verse 3, is all the cleansing plus the necessity to bring a kapara, to bring a carbon. Again, this is a fascinating understanding of Torah. The Torah is, but we learn that's why the 13 principles of Rabbi Yishmael that we say every day about the how we look at the Torah, right? We have the 13 principles, Kal V'chomer, the Pesukim, Gezer Shava. The idea is that you have the straightforward information that we try to understand. That's not easy on its own. What does that mean? So tight twice, we have to learn that means that you have to have 4 boxes of tefillin. So that's one limud. Then you have wordings and flow of things and how psukim go into each other. These are all the principles to teach us things. So if chapter 15 verse 2 has the word zav 2 times, it's not just by chance. It's not being poetic. It's mentioning it 2 times and talking about impurity to tell you that a person who has 2 emissions is tamei. The next verse that says the word zav 3 times, okay, you could say, well, it means this, it means that. There's a reason for it. It puts it in one verse 3 times to tell you there's a concept of 3 riyas. What's the difference in 2 and 3? From that we learn the difference is a carbon. Menoni mili, the shav and the tumah, vein shav and the carbon. How do we know what the Mishnah teaches us? Rashi says that they're equal. A zav of 2 riyas is equal to a zav of 3 riyas in everything in impurity, means that it makes mishkav and moishav. And klicheres, we're going to learn. All these severe impurities, how do you know that they're equal? And they're not equal when it comes to the sacrifices. So he says, like we learned in the pasuk, that a person who has a zav, has a discharge, it's from his flesh is the discharge. Then the pasuk stamps tamehu, that person's tamei. That's a person who sees 2 riyas, 2 discharges. Then the next pasuk says, Harei shtei zivois menois kan v'kori tamei. The Torah mentions 2 discharges and still calls the person tamei. And then we have a pasuk that says shalish v'kori tamei. That's the next verse. This is what defines the person as being impure. Bizavai, when there's a zavai, there's a discharge. Rar b'sarai, a zavai, again zavai. I hechtem b'sari mizavai, or it blocks the discharge through the discharge causes a blockage of the person's ability to urinate, etc. It's hari l'cha shalish. Then you have 3 times. Kari tamei tumasahi, the person's tamei. If a person becomes already impure with 2 riyas, with 2 discharges, obviously by the 3rd time he's already impure. What's the addition? Why does the pasuk talk about 3? We talked about 2. 2 is in 3 is included 2. The aim is therefore shtayim l'tumah v'lo l'karban. So the answer is that the equal in tumah, but the carbon is only for the 3rd. So now the Gemara says, how do you know? Okay, we know that you have 2 psukim. One pasuk that talks about 2 discharges and 1 emissions, and one that talks about 3 emissions. But how do we know what we learn from them? Maybe the Gemara says, "Shtayim l'tumah v'loy l'karban, shalish l'karban v'loy l'tumah." Maybe a person who has 2 emissions is impure but doesn't bring a sacrifice. The one who has 3 emissions brings a sacrifice but's not impure. So then, what's the obvious answer? That doesn't make any sense. The person became tamei already. He never became impure from the first 2. If a person has 3 days, let's say it's in 3 days, not 3 episodes, 3 days. So by the 2nd day, the person's already tamei. Mishkav, Moishav, Klicheres, everything has to have 7 clean days. Has to go to Mayim Chaim. Now there's a 3rd day. So now what is added? The carbon. Well, how could you have the person doesn't become impure, but has to bring a carbon? That doesn't make sense. Now, this question of the Gemara is not so simple, because the Gemara asks a lot of questions that are seemingly simple questions with simple answers. But there's limits. Even the Gemara has limits to simple questions. So there's the commentaries, the Pnei Yeshua and others, that are trying to figure out what was even the thinking of the Gemara, but that they get into length to discuss it. But there is some sort of idea here that you could think that there's a difference, that someone who sees 3 riyas wouldn't be tamei, but would need a carbon. The question would not be about the tumah itself, I think one of the answers the Pnei Yeshua gives is not about the tumah itself, but about the actual discharge. If the discharge itself is tamei, if someone were to touch, or if the discharge itself were to fall onto something, does it make it tamei? Means the person, of course, is tamei because he saw two. That's not a question. The question is if the third emission itself is tamei, or that's no longer tamei, and it's just the carbon has to come in, but any discharge that happens after two would not be tamei. But that's maybe the Pnei Yeshua's answer to, if I understand correctly, to the thinking of the question. But the Gemara doesn't stay with the question. The Gemara says, if once the person's tummy and everything included spit, anything else, any liquids that comes out of the zav, we know how severe the zav is in his impurity. So that already happened by two. Obviously, that extends to three. So the Rashi says, "Shtaim l'tuma l'kol chumra l'tuma zav." We would think that maybe all the severities of the impurity of the zav only applies to someone who has two riyas, two emissions. So, but when it comes to three, we would just classify him as a regular barkeri. A barkeri is shif chazera. That's not that's just a tumas erev. That's only impure till the night, and you don't have to go to Ma'im Chaim. It doesn't have mishkav Moshe. Rosh Tayim varikfa yard l'chol chumrei tuma mi yaitziah. Whoever took him out. So the Gemara says, how could you say that? The person becomes a severe impurity that includes everything: his bedding, his chairs, his earthenware, his requirement for 7 clean days, his requirement for going to a spring water, not just any water. That already happened after 2. So that he can't. No, he never got out of that situation. It's not like there was a purification and now comes a third out of nowhere, because the third out of nowhere would be a first again. It started again. So the Gemara says, okay, maybe let's the Gemara asks another question. Ve'ema, maybe ve'emar shtayim lekarbon v'loy letuma. Maybe on the contrary, that a person who has 2 riyas is not tamei. It's a regular balkeri, a regular person who has seminal discharge, but doesn't have the severity of the zav, but has to bring a sacrifice. Shalish afu tuma, and by third, you bring a sacrifice plus you become extremely a tamei, mishkav Moshe, etc. So the Gemara says no. That you can't say. Meaning to say that a zav of 2 riyas is no different than a balkeri aside for a carbon. And a zav of 3 riyas is that's what kicks in is the tumah, the severity of the impurity. He can't think that. Why? The Tanya v'chiper alav hakohen lifnei Hashem mizavoy. Okay, if you remember at the last verse 15, I pointed out that verse when we saw it. And in verse 15, it talks about is it 15? It's not 15. Why is he saying it's 15? Yeah, so it says also I saw a kohen that talks about the sacrifice. That the kohen does the sacrifice. One is a chatas, one is a oila, the 2 birds. One is a burnt sacrifice, one is a sin sacrifice. V'chiper alav a kohen, he gets a kapara, an atonement. Lifnei Hashem, from God, mizavai, from within, from part of, mizavai means from part of his discharge, not from all of his discharge. Meaning to say, the Tanya v'chiper alav a kohen lifnei Hashem mizavai mixas zavim mevin carbon or mixas zavim mevin carbon. Your question was that both the zav of 2 riyas and the zav of 3 riyas should bring a carbon, that the difference of the third person is only that there's the intense impurity. No, because the carbon in the word in the carbon, it says the word mizavai, from part of his zav. Not every zav has to bring a carbon. So the fact that the word says mizavai comes to teach us that not all zavim bring a carbon. Who would bring a carbon? So we have to say that if they're equal in the tumah, and they're not equal in the carbon. Mix of zavim maybe carbon, mix of zavim maybe carbon. Okay, it's that. Roi shalish maybe, shtayim maybe. So what is it? How is it possible that some zav that a zav, some zavin will bring and some zavin will not? The difference is if you see 2, you see 3. So both of them are impure, and the addition is only, like our Mishnah says, only in the carbon. And how do we know that? From the word mizavai. Because mizavai means to exclude. Not all situations of a zav has to bring a carbon. Rashi says mizavav mashras mixas zavai, only some people that are zav, not all. Okay, mizavai mixas zavin. So Rav Steinzalt says this is the word from the understanding that the letter mem mizavai in the word mizavai is meaning from as meaning from, in other words, limiting the scope of the halacha. Mizavai is coming to limit the scope of the law of the carbon. Therefore, there are certain cases where the zav requires atonement and cases where he does not. And what would be the difference? The difference would be if it's 2 riyas and 1 riyah, or 3 riyas. Okay, we learned this already we studied this in the beginning of the class, that the discharge of zav, for some reason this should have been in the beginning of our sugya, that it's the condition of zav as we know today is gonorrhea, which is, he says here, it's not even a semen as we know it, it's a kind of pus discharge. And it's only in a mucus, and it's only affects the tumah, only affects men, even though the condition could affect women as well. But as far as the tumah is concerned, it's only one that affects men. And therefore the person is a severe impurity if that's what it in fact is. Okay. So he says, one second. If back to the question, the Gemara says, "Mi zavai." Okay, we get it. That only some people who become a zav have to bring a carbon. Not all people need a kapar, but maybe the person who has 2 riyas brings the carbon. The person who has 3 riyas doesn't bring a carbon. So they're asking every possible question, even though some of the questions seem to be a bit silly. How could you say that? Because if every person who saw 3 emissions saw 2, right? 3 is in addition to 2. So once you saw 2 and you're a chayv of carbon, there's no such thing as you don't have to bring a carbon. You never satisfied the carbon. You can't say that after you saw the 3rd charge, you downgrade your impurity, that you don't have to bring a carbon. Even though this is less of a question than the first question about tumah. Tumah, to say you're tamei and you didn't after 2 riyas and you're not tamei after 3 riyas, that's very hard. The Pnei Yeshua's question is very strong. But a carbon, actually, there's some logic there. You could say that a carbon is that 3 kind of maybe, I'm just talking about, again, we're not learning, this is not the Tractate of Zav. That's its own tractate, but that deals with these laws in the Rambam. But we're just trying to compare the laws. So we're learning it on a half a foot. But the logic we could say is that once there's kind of a consistent level of emissions, maybe then we kind of attribute it more to the disease versus the impurity part of it. But the Gemara doesn't accept that. The Gemara says once you had 3, you're already obligated to bring a carbon. Obviously, when you're 3, that obligation never left. Okay, so now we have basically we're tackling this Mishnah from 2 cases. First, we're tackling the Mishnah we brought from Rab Simai. Rab Simai is to teach us in general, how do we know that there's such a thing as 2 riyas and 3 riyas? So we know that there's 2 emissions and 3 emissions. There's 2, so the classifications of the Zav. Rabbi Simai says from the Pasuk that this Pasuk, chapter 15, verse 2, and chapter 15, verse 3. Verse 2 says 2 times Zav and calls him Tameh, and verse 3 says 3 times Zav and calls him Tameh. Why do we have to have 2 verses? 2 verses comes to teach us that there's a difference. The difference is what? The carbon. So that's one limud that we have. We asked, one second, maybe the carbon. Maybe, how do we know what the difference is? Maybe we're trying to figure out. Maybe the person who is maybe both of them bring carbon, but they are not both tamei. Then we have the limud mizavai. So we have 2 limudim. So the Gemara says now we need both those limudim. We need to learn from Rab Simai that shows us that there's a difference between 2 riyas and 3 riyas, the 2 psukim, and also we need the verse of chapter 15, verse 15, that says mizavai, that only some of the Zav bring a carbon, not all of them. The imid Rab Simai, if we just have Rab Simai, have a miniki question, we could ask that question. What was our question? Maybe the difference is in carbon, not in Tumah. Maybe both of them maybe the difference is in Tumah, not carbon. Maybe both the Zav of 2 riyas and 3 riyas have to bring a carbon. The difference of the intensity of the psukim is that a 3rd one is also intense, is very impure. There is never a thought to think the person is not impure. The question is if the person is a bal carrier or not. Are you a bal carrier or a zav? It's not the same classification. Do you have to wait 7 days? Do you make mishkav ma'ishav? The severity of the impurity. Maybe just you have to bring a carbon, but you're not so severely impure. So therefore, we can't just have Rabbi Simai because we don't know what the 2 psukim mean. So therefore, we need mizavai to teach us. It can't be talking about the carbon, that they both have to bring a carbon, and therefore the difference is only tumah. It has to therefore be talking about they're both the psukim are coming to teach us that they're both tamei. And mizavai, we teach that only the carbon only applies to the 3rd one. Kamashmala mizavai. But so then let's just say mizavai. Be mizavai. Lo yadana kamariyas. I would never know how many we need. The first 2 psukim Rab Simai to teach us first of all the status. There's 2 things here. What is a zav? And how do you get out of it? And how impure is the zav? So what is a zav? Rab Simai says the pasuk teaches us any man who has this discharge, this emission in 2 episodes or 3 episodes. How do you achieve purification and atonement? So from this we have the verse to teach us that the only difference between verse 2 and verse 3 would be the mizaveh, the carbon. So if you put both limudim together, it gives us a clear picture, as much as possible, of what are the laws of a zav. The laws of a zav is 2 emissions or 3 emissions or more. The level of impurity is equal. The level of purification, as far as counting 7 clean days in the mikvah, ma'im chaim, is equal. Mizaveh comes to teach us the carbon is only for the one who has 3 emissions, not 2. Rab Simai comes to teach us how many episodes, how many emissions is considered a zav in the first place. So Rashi says, we still don't know what makes a person a zav in the first place. The Mizaveh only says that there's 2 levels of zav. What are those 2 levels? It could be 2 emissions, 1 emission, 3 emissions, 5 emissions, 10 emissions. So that we need the first Reb Simai to teach us the 2 psukim. And then on top of that, we say what's the difference between the 2 levels of zav is not the intensity of the tumah, but the requirement to bring a carbon or not. Okay. Now that we have the pasuk v'hashta damart mizaveh lidrasha, now that the Gemara says 1 second, it's not so simple. Then the fact that it says that the word mizavah is coming to teach us something, and what do we say the word mizavah, the mem of the mizavah, comes to limit who has to bring a carbon in the zav, if it's 2 emissions or 3. We have another verse that we learned before. The verse over here, which verse is it? It's the verse of 13. So 15:13 says, in the beginning of the cleansing process, also says, V'chiyiter hazav mizavai, when he stops having his emissions, so he's clean, then he has to count, Safar la shivas yamim, he has to count 7 clean days. Lihitarase, from him stopping to see his discharge. V'chibes begad, if he washes his clothes. V'rachas b'sari, he has to immerse himself in ma'im chaim, into a spring, not just any mikveh v'tar, and then he becomes pure. But what's the question here? The Gemara says 1 second. It also says v'chi yitar zav mizavai, and if the word mizavai is a limitation, then maybe a zav of 2 riyas also doesn't have to count 7 days. Maybe the same mizavai that's limiting the carbon is also limiting the general cleansing process, not just the atonement part. So that's what the Gemara says now. If you want to say the word mizavah is coming to teach us something, to limit, like in the case of the carbon in verse 15 that says only the emission of 3, only the zav of 3 emissions has to bring a carbon, but not the one of 2. So what's the mizavah of the cleansing process? Maybe the zav of 2 doesn't have to count 7 days. Maybe he doesn't have to go to Ma'am Chaim. What are you using the word mizavi for? It has to teach us something. It's a drasha. So the Gemara says, oh, slow down. We need that for something else. It says in the pasuk v'chiyitar hazav. So again, the pasuk says v'chiyitar hazav liksheyifsek, when you stop seeing your discharge. Mizavai v'loi mizavai v'nigoy. It's coming to limit another scenario. The problem is what happens. We have other situations of impurity for a person. A person could be, unfortunately, suffering from 2 levels of impurity. One impurity of zav, and another impurity of tsaras. What happens if a person who has leprosy, who's also impure, and has the impurity of which is very unique, a live person to walk into a space and make that space tameh, tumas oyel, that only exists by mace. That's why a Metzorah, right? What did we learn in Parshas, the end of last week's Parsha, right? Parshas, the end of last week's Parsha, Parshas V'aleischa, it talks about Miriam, the severity of tsaras, of leprosy. A leper is considered like dead. Therefore, the leper has the effect of just like a mace in an enclosure, in an oil, causes everything inside the enclosure to become tamei. So too Metzorah. So here Metzorah also, that's why he has to live outside the base. He has to be out of 3 machinais. What happens if a leper is unfortunate to be suffering from 2 impurities? He's a zav and a leper at the same time. So the question is, can a person while they're still in the process of getting cleansed from their leprosy, how do they deal with the time of getting cleansed from their zav, from being a zav? Now, there are certain things you can't do because you're still dealing with the leprosy. But could you at least do partial so to say, cleansing while you're a Metzorah from the Zav, and wait for the completion of it, because you can't do a kapara. Even if you have 3 riyas, you can't bring a carbon because you're a Metzorah. So that's the question. We need him for such a situation. That a person comes impure of zav and he's already at Baal Tzaras, he could impure himself from his zav, but not from his nega. Mizavai v'safar v'limid has ala zav bal shtei riyas shetan sfir shiva. So the fact is that when you are to get totally pure is only from mizavai, but you didn't come impure, you still have to deal with your tzaras. And why does the pasuk add mizavai v'safar? To teach us that the zav of 2 riyas also has to count 7 pure days. Again, just to see the verse inside. The verse inside says like this, 13. V'chiyitar hazav mizavai. What's that coming to say? Stop. It could have said v'chiyitar hazav. Why does it have to say v'chiyitar hazav mizavai? We know what he's suffering from. We know that he's a zav. We've been talking about it for 13 verses. Why do we have to say when the man with discharge is cleansed from his discharge? What else are we talking about? So the word from his discharge is extra. Coming to teach us, mizavai v'lai miniga. You're only cleansed, it means you could count 7 days, and you could go to the mikveh with, you could count 7 days, and you've already counted the 7 clean days from your zav, but you can't do anything about the nega, you're still tzaras. Mizavai v'safar means to add that the zav, even from 2 riyas, has to count. Shivas yamim tarasa. Let's see Rashi. Rashi goes through the psukim. When a person stops having the discharge, so you don't go to the mikvah before you count. Doesn't help to go to the mikvah before you count. It means after the person has the discharge, you don't go to the mikvah. There's no reason to go to mikvah. After you've stopped having your zav yimna, you count 7 days. What does it mean from your emissions, not from your emissions and your leprosy? If a person was both a Zav and a Metzorah, you both suffered from the impurities of being a Zav and leprosy. Now you no longer have this emission. But you haven't been cured yet from your leprosy. We don't require the person to start counting 7 clean days only after he gets rid of the leprosy. He could start counting the 7 clean days even while he has leprosy, because he's counting 7 clean days not from his leprosy, 7 clean days from his emissions. So that's fine. He starts counting right away. And it counts. These 7 days count. Even if during those 7 days you're still impure from the leprosy, but that's a separate impurity. When you become healed from your leprosy, however long that takes, yitfol, then you go to the mikveh, because no point in going to the mikveh while you're still a leper. Then you go to the mikveh, and then the mikveh that you go to the first time, because the Metzorah has to go to the mikveh twice, counts. So for the first mikveh of the Metzorah, but what does it make a difference? Why does it make a difference if the Metzorah anyways has to count another 7 days and has to again go to the mikveh a second time and has to shave himself and then bring a kapara? What does it help to go to the mikveh after the first time, for the zav? So it does make a difference, because you're no longer causing your bedding or your chairs to become tamei, because the Metzorah doesn't have that kind of tumah. Metzorah has other kind of tumah. A Metzorah doesn't make mishkav v'maishav tamei. And also, you're no longer going to make earthenware impure, like a zav does, and a Metzorah doesn't. Beheset kedin zav. Even though you have to count another 7 days from your leprosy. And also you have to be able to eat from the kachim, and you need to have a second immersion in the mikveh. Like we learned the laws of Metzorah. So we learn about the leper that after this first mikveh, you have to count another 7 days. V'rachas b'sarav mayim, ahani tefillah kamaisa l'tari mitam mishka v'maychev v'kli cheres b'hasek. That's fine. But still, the severity of the Zav, which has a different kind of Tumah, the Tumah of Mishka v'maychev, and if you move a Kli Cheres, that severity won't apply anymore. So let's just break this down. If a person is unfortunately a Zav and a Metzorah, so there's nothing you could do about coming totally clean, because you have to get rid of both Tumahs. But you could do partial. So what do you have to do? The word Mizave comes to teach us that you count 7 clean days from whenever you stop the mission, even if you're still Tamid Tzaras. Why would you count the 7 clean days, even though you can't go to the mikveh yet? Because after you count the 7 clean days, no longer will you make a mishkav and ma'ishav tamid and hesed klicheres and moving a klicheres, earthenware. Then you get finally cleansed from your tzaras, your leprosy. Then you do the mikveh that counts for both the first mikveh of the Metzorah and the mikveh for the zav. Then you have to, of course, count another 7 days, go to mikveh a second time, and then, of course, you could bring your carbon if you're a Metzorah if you're a zav of 3, and other things that you could now join the congregation because you got rid of both of them. But there's no reason not to get rid of what you can get rid of, even during the process of the cleansing yourself of the leprosy. To teach us. To teach us that even if you only hear the mikzas is the other way, that even if you have a little of zav, you still have to count. Limud al zav b'shtei has to count 7 clean days. So now the Gemara asks the question as follows. Again, I told you guys from the beginning, this is not an easy sugya. There's a whole tractate on these laws. We're trying to catch in a whole tractate of very complicated laws in one sitting of a Mishnah. But that's the beauty of the Gemara. You never know what the Gemara is going to give us. Sometimes the Gemara will give us stories. Sometimes the Gemara will give us something nice and pleasant. Sometimes the Gemara will give us a difficult sugya. You go with what you got. So this week we got a difficult sugya. The Gemara says it's a kal v'chomer. How would you think? Why do we have to have the pasuk to say mizavai v'sofer, that he counts 7 days, if he's so impure that he causes bedding and chairs to become tamei? Meaning, even if he doesn't touch it, just by the fact that they supported him, it becomes tamei. And not only that, it becomes tamei that if someone else touches it after he leaves, that person also becomes tamei, becomes avatuma. Of course, he has to count 7 days. Why wouldn't he have to count 7 days? Then why do you need the pasuk to teach us like a chiddush? Lo yitoyin svir shiva bitmia. Achisha matishtayim v'achigasinan. V'halaydinu im metam mishka v'maisha b'shtei riz l'chol chumar tu mazav mihechin ismat misfir. Why wouldn't he have to count 7 clean days? Let's skip this Tosfos because it's not so simple. The Rashi that we just learned, we're learning it a bit as Amaratzim because it's not so simple about the laws of a Metzorah. He says over here, Yesh Farm the Garsei, B'taris Kainer, Shetam Mishkav Meisha, V'tirs Rashi, Dahainu L'tami Oichlin Amashkin, Avloi Tami Adam Kaden Goin Zav. The laws of Mishkav Meisha also seem to be talking about Metzorah. So the question is, we're trying to figure out why would you count for the Zav while you're still impure? So Rashi says because you no longer will you make Mishkav Meishav Tamei on the level of Zav. But it seems like also it's not so clear if a Metzorah makes Mishkav Meishav Tamei or not. If a Metzorah also makes Mishkav Meishav, so then what's the point of counting now? So that Taisa says the difference is it's not so simple. The question is if it comes in Avatuma, if it only becomes Eichel Mashkin. Means if someone touches it, does a person become Tamei from a Metzorah or only makes clothing, food and liquids? Okay, we'll let that one slide. Let's continue the Gemara. So the Gemara says, so what was the question? The question is, why would you even think that something that's so severely tamei would not need 7 clean days, that you don't have to count 7 clean days? If a zav of 2 riyas makes mishkav meishav, and there's no reason to think that it doesn't, because there's nothing in the pasuk to suggest that there's any miyut. And Evi Zav, we already have 15 to tell us that 2 riyas, like Simai says, is a Zav. And then the rest of the psukim from 2 to 13 describe the severity of the Zav. That the Zav is Mishkav Meishav Klicheres, very impure, is an Avatuma, makes a Mishkav Avatuma, right? So we know that. Then we have the word Mizavai coming to teach us that he also has to count 7. Why wouldn't he have to count 7? Give me 1 second. We have a basis for that question. A woman who has two, again, the laws of Nida are complicated today because we don't separate a woman. Every woman who bleeds is tamei. We're chayshish the chumrah. We're chayshish the chumrah that it's a zava. Today we don't go according to the biblical law of Tumah. We don't count that there's 7 days and 11 days. According to the Torah, the 7 days is a nida, and there's 11 days where a woman's supposed to be clean. And if she has bleeding in those 11 days, then it's not in its proper time. If it's not in proper time, then it's not regular, and therefore she becomes more tamei than she would in a nida. Today we don't know, we don't count properly, so therefore we're chayshish always the chumrah that all bleeding is a zava. But we say, in the biblical law, if a woman sees only 1 day in those 11 clean days that she has, so then she counts only 1 day for one vision for what she has to have. She has to have 3 riyas, right? So if she has 2 riyas, she only has to count 1 day. She doesn't have to count 7 days. But in that 1 day, she's matam mishkav v'moshav. Shiva. Only a woman who sees 3 times bleeding in the 11 days, then she has to count 7 clean days. But if a woman sees 1 day, she counts 1 day and that's it. She goes to the mikveh at the end of the 1 day. So she doesn't have to. She's not matama mishkav v'moshav. But she is matama mishkav v'moshav even in that 1 day. So we see that you could be so impure to cause even bedding and chairs, i.e., support, to be tamei. You don't have to count 7 days. So the laws of zav should show us that possibly also zav could be tamei and not have to count 7 days. And that's why we have to have a special limit from our pasuk mizavai v'sipar. So let's just the Rashi. If a woman sees blood in 1 or 2 days in the 11 clean days that she has, again, biblically, there's a difference in a nida and a zava, right? A woman has her time that she's supposed to have her bleeding, that's 7 days only. So those 7 days, if you see it 1 day, you see it 7 days, that's it. There's 7 days, and after 7 days, she goes to the mikvah. There's no counting. The counting is only if there's a zava. The zava is if she sees in the time she shouldn't be seeing, which is in her 11 clean days. But she only sees 1 day or 2 days, so she counts 1 day to make sure that it's not a consistency. And if that 1 day is clean, then she goes to the mikvah. And nevertheless, until she goes to the mikvah, she makes tamei mishkav moshav. So we see you don't need 7 days to clean from the tumah of mishkav moshav. Shemitam mishkav moshav b'shmaisa brayse in Sach Nida marvinanle. We learn it in the laws of Nida. We learned why to prove that she makes mishkav moshav even lying or sitting. Makes a tamei, even though she doesn't have to count 7 days. We see that the severity, it's possible that the zav of 2 omissions should be so severe to tamei, causing mishkav moshav, but still would not require 7 clean days. So here, Reb Steinzatz gives us a little insight. A lesser zava who observes a clean day for 1 or 2 days of discharge also renders vessels impure through contact and transmits ritual impurity to a surface designated for lying and a surface designated for sitting, rendering them a primary source of ritual impurity, meaning avatuma. So says the Rambam. So we see clearly that a woman can make mishkav moshav tuma, avatuma. That means anyone who touches it, even after she leaves the bed or the sitting, becomes tamei, and she doesn't have to count 7 days. Let's just do one more piece here. Don't ask a question. So you would think the same thing applies to a zav. That a zav could be so severely tamei, but if it's only 2 riyas, which would mean that would also be a difference between a zav of 3 riyas and 2 riyas, not just a carbon, and doesn't have to count 7 days. Even something that's only partial zav, which is 2 riyas, also has to count 7 clean days. Mikzas zavi v'safar, even if you're only a mikzas, you count 7 clean days. Limud al zav bal shtei riyas, shetayin sfir shiva, also has to count 7 clean days. So just to summarize it, we'll have to finish the next piece. It's a small piece. We'll finish it next week on now the next question Rav and Abai are going to ask is that there's an obvious question, right? Because we're using the word mizava in two opposite directions. The word mizava in chapter 15, verse 15, comes to teach us that only a zav of 3 riyas has to have a carbon. Means it's coming to limit the zav of 2 riyas. And the word mizava in chapter 15, verse 13, is coming to include the zav that he has to also count 7. So how could you have the word mizavai that's coming? How does it work both ways? So that the Gemara is going to analyze next week. But just to summarize what we know so far, that there's the laws of zav, a person who has a seminal discharge. It's not your regular typical seminal discharge, which is called a balkari. It's a disease that's connected with tumah that the tumah afflicts is affected by men. Rabbi Steinzel says is a kind of illness called gonorrhea. Not caused by any typical reason why a person should have a seminal discharge. If you have 2 episodes, even in one day, or 2 in 2 consecutive days, so you have all the severity of impurity, means you're an avatuma, which means that you cause even bedding that you don't touch. Means if you're lying on a mattress and the mattress is on top of another mattress and vice versa, and continuation, that all that becomes tummy. And even after you leave, if someone to touch the bed becomes tummy until the night and has to go to the mikveh, which means a high level of tumah. And you also would have to count 7 clean days, and you have to go to Mayim Chaim to ritual. You have to go to the bathing in natural spring water, not just any mikvah. If you have 3 days, and on top of that, you have to also bring a korban, an atonement. And we went through all the psukim in chapter 15, between verse 1 and 15, that supports this Mishnah to teach us that the bottom line is the only difference between a zav of 2 riyas and 3 riyas is the question of korban. All other requirements are equal. And we're just going to tackle next week, just finish off this sugya, which is going to tackle just the limud of mizavai. How do we have it going both ways? And we'll hopefully get through that. The next Mishnah is going to deal with the laws of Metzorah, also complicated. I think after we finish the next Mishnah, we kind of go into easier topics. So one more difficult class, and I think we're going to kind of go back into something that's a little more easier, lighter on the head at night. Laila Tov, everyone. Thank you so much for joining.
Laila Tov, Rabbi.